It's the weekend and you have financial questions that need answering. That can only mean one thing. It's time for Jill on Money, the show that takes the mystery out of your finances. Here's your host, Jill Schlesinger.
Welcome. It is Jill on Money. It is August. That's right. It is August, my friends. We are delighted that you are joining us today. We are broadcasting from the Capital One Bank virtual studios. Capital One. This is Banking Reimagined. What's in your wallet? And just want to give you a heads up that we are going to be taking a little bit of a vacation over the next couple of weekends. Not this weekend, but we are going to rebroadcast some interviews that we conducted prior to the pandemic. So, in the next few weeks when you hear our guests, and certainly in this show in the second hour, you're not going to hear us talk about the pandemic because it had not happened. But that said, we have chosen these, or Mark has chosen these specifically, curated these to try to match the times. So I just want to give you that heads up. Also, want to let you know that if you've got a financial question, we would love to hear from you. Our email address is askjill@jillonmoney.com. askjill@jillonmoney.com. Okay, Jennifer writes, "Hi, Jill. I enjoyed hearing about how energized you were after waking early and exercising on a Friday morning. That's my secret weapon for combating stress and maintaining a positive attitude. I reside in New Jersey. I love living here, but discussions of additional state tax hikes are making me very nervous. I am a married mother of 4 children. My husband and I both work, but the strain of property tax, income tax, and all the other taxes we pay in New Jersey has put us at the breaking point. If taxes were to increase further, we'll have to consider moving to another state. In New Jersey, there is a so-called exit tax. Can you explain this tax to me? Our primary residence is our only asset. After writing this, I'm now in need of a run. Ha, your show is great. I appreciate your kindness and uplifting nature. With sincere thanks, burned out from paying taxes in New Jersey." The Garden State. It is a very difficult thing to consider when you're paying so much in taxes. So I think this idea of tax, this exit tax, it's not actually a additional tax. It is, I believe, a prepayment of potential income tax due from the sale of the home. So anyway, it's essentially going to be part of the sale of your home. But in that respect, it kind of depends whether you've bought your house really cheap and how much you have paid in terms of putting in any additions or improvements in the home. So maybe the primary residence will not actually cost you any money, and there won't be an exit tax because you will have been underneath the $500,000 threshold that would trigger long-term capital gains on your move. But hey, I'd like to know more about what's going on and what other assets you have and where you're considering a move to. That I'm also very interested in. So let us know. Okay, John writes, "I heard your show last Saturday and I was hoping for some basic advice. My wife and I are 48. We have 4 kids. One that's out of college, a high school senior, a high school junior, and a 3rd grader. My wife is a teacher, so assuming New York State doesn't change teacher retirement plans, she will have a pension when she retires." Just sidebar here, guys. Most of these plans, they're not going to get rid of pensions. They just might make it tougher to actually finish your career with the years that you imagine. So I've heard about some school systems where they started at 30 years you have to be in. Now it's 35 years. So Those are the kinds of changes I would expect in terms of someone who's in their 40s and working in a place that has a municipal pension. Okay, let's get back to John. John says, I've always taken the approach that we need to survive off my 401k and that her pension would be gravy. I started my own business 4 years ago. It's been successful so far, but I'm worried about whether it will continue to be profitable. I should be okay for the rest of 2020, fingers crossed. With the success of my business, all right, let's get this now. What have they done? With the success of my business, we were able to pay off all of our debt, mortgage and cars. We have already paid for our oldest daughter's college. We have $500,000 in my 401k, 100,000 in savings, 20 grand in an operating checking account, 20 grand in a 529, and another 20 grand in additional savings for college. We continue to save $1,500 a month for college. Through the business, I max out my 401k, and then the business contributes another 15,000 in profit sharing. So the total is around $33,000 a year. The $100,000 in savings is fairly new. I'm looking for advice on what to do with it in lieu of just sitting in a savings account. I've been a construction manager for 25 years, so I was toying with the idea of rental properties. I would start an LLC, take out a mortgage, as opposed to using our savings. But I don't know if you had other suggestions. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, John, I mean, this is a hard one. I don't actually think you should take this as your wife's money as gravy. I wouldn't do that at all. I would run your retirement numbers with your with her current pension estimate, as well as your 401k. As far as starting an LLC to buy real estate, I don't really have a big opinion. It sounds like you would know what you're doing as opposed to most other knuckleheads who do this kind of thing. So I think that could be a good idea. I do think that if you're worried about the business, I would very much stick to a fatter emergency reserve fund than a skinnier one. So you would want to have, again, that would be more like 12 months of your expenses in the bank. I'm not a huge fan of paying off mortgages. You've done it already. So maybe what I would consider is trying to just start a supplemental retirement savings account, which would just be a general investment account. Alternatively, you could take some of that $100,000, again, if that's over the amount you need, and plow it into the 529 plan. It is a fantastic way to save money for college. And one other thing I would just want to ask, and that is your wife contributing to a deferred compensation through the school system, a 403B? That's another idea, to put more money away. I think you guys need to figure out what your priority is. Is it really getting your kids through college? Is it putting enough money away for retirement? When you plan to retire? All of these things would come into play. It sounds like you're in good shape, but I don't want you to necessarily move too quickly on this 100 grand. It may just be very happy in its home of a safe emergency reserve fund. So I hope that helps. And if you have follow-up questions or you want to get back to us, please feel free to send another email. Okay, gang, this is Jill on Money. And during the break, here's what you should do. Go to our website, jillonmoney.com, and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It is free. Mark does it every Friday. It's awesome. And you may want to check out the new section of the website called the Furry Fan Club. You'll see me with my 2 little children. And scroll on down. There are even a couple of cats. Yes, I did put cats after getting yelled at by somebody with not having enough cats. So send us your pictures, especially if you're walking with us. Okay, it's Jill on Money. We'll be right back.
Back to Jill on Money, where Jill Schlesinger helps you take the mystery out of your finances.
You're back. It's Jill on Money, the program that attempts to take the mystery out of your financial life. And we are, delighted to be with you, but I know it's August and I know that there are a lot of concerns out there about what's going on in the universe. You're worried about your health. You're worried about your money. All these things are bubbling to the fore. Mark just said, it's been 4 months since this all started, really. When most of us went home and kind of started working from home if we were lucky enough to still have jobs. 4 months, it feels like 4 years to me. And yet it feels like just yesterday. I did have the occasion to actually go out to a restaurant recently for the first time in 4 months. That was kind of weird. It was outdoors and everyone was wearing masks. And I would say that most of the tables were about 10 or 12 feet away from one another. And it was great. It was happy. I was sort of almost like it was almost normal, but I'm not rushing back to do it anytime soon. That's what I can tell you about that. So it was a great experience, but not that interested in doing that again. Just got to say. All right. If you have had a different experience, feel free to let me know. Send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. Askjill@jillonmoney.com. Let's answer some more of your questions. This is from David, who's got a question about variable life insurance policies and their usefulness for long-term care planning. David writes, my mother is 64 and I currently assist with managing her money and her taxes, etc. My mother's financial advisor recently recommended a variable universal life policy, VUL, for her in the event she might need long-term care down the road and could begin incurring potentially large medical bills. The benefit, as described to me, would be having this sum of money to tap into that's outside of my mother's estate, thus preventing her from significantly eroding the value of her estate. I've attached the details of the VUL policy for reference. Mom is in good health. She's got roughly $7 million to her name. $7 million. Oh my gosh. As such, she certainly has the means to afford long term care without purchasing a policy. Okay, right. That's exactly what I thought. $7 million, you can self insure. David says, I'm typically not a fan of complex insurance products as they are often accompanied by exorbitant fees, no exception with this specific policy. Given the high fees and my mother's financial stability, is there any justifiable reason at all for her to move forward with this policy? Seems pretty clear cut to me, but wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something on my end. Thank you in advance for your thoughts. Love the podcast as well as your work across other media platforms. Cheers, David. Okay, well, how can I say this nicely? This is not a financial advisor I would do anything with. This is an insane idea. So I happen to know that the person who presented this, the advisor's name is Bill. Okay, let's call him Bill. This is ridiculous. It's $1 million policy for nothing. She doesn't need insurance. She doesn't even need long-term care insurance. She can self-insure. I have no idea why anybody would actually choose this as a actual policy for her or strategy for her. That's what I should say, strategy. It's not just like a little bit expensive, it's a lot of bit expensive. There is absolutely no reason that you should do this. By the way, my favorite part of the policy, because there's an illustration of the policy, I love when they say hypothetical annual gross returns of 6%. 6%? I doubt it. I doubt you're going to get 6%. These policies, and by the way, the surrender period's a long time. The fees are a lot. It's crazy. In fact, this would actually cause me to say to your mom, why are you working with this financial advisor? $7 million net worth. You do not need any insurance. Absolutely no. No, no, no. Mark, was that emphatic enough? No, no, no. That's a no. That's a hard no. It makes me so angry. It's like really, it's just stupid. Hey, look, you know what? I sold a bunch of variable universal life policies in my day when I was an advisor because at that time, the tax law was different. The capital gains rates were much higher and variable life policies were expensive, but they could work as like a supplemental retirement planning vehicle. But this is insanity. This is crazy. Okay. Here's Suzanne, who writes, with the virus going on now, one of the things we enjoy is listening to you on the weekend while we're driving. Here's my question. My husband recently retired and has roughly $950,000 invested with Vanguard and his government thrift savings plan. I have $60,000 in Vanguard from a previous job. We have no debt, and with my husband's pension and my salary, which is about $25,000 a year, and a rental property that provides about $1,000 a month, we have income of about $5,000 a month. We live a modest life. Rental properties worth about $125,000, our house $225,000. We have a CD for $150,000 that matures in December. Suzanne says that her husband is telling her the $5,000 a month covers everything. They've got about $30,000 in their checking account. And now, with the maturing CD coming due, that would be the emergency funds. And the question is, of course, rates are dropping pretty low. So what do you do? Okay. You should not be worried. It doesn't seem to be any problem at all. I don't think you should take Social Security early. I'm not sure why you're worrying so much. It seems like everything is good. I would wait to your full retirement age. I would try to keep that money in a emergency reserve fund. And I'm not sure that I would actually put it into a Roth. I'm not sure you even need to do that, but I think you could go to depositaccounts.com. You can search for a higher interest CD. You may even have a couple of CDs and try to stagger it a little bit, but I'm not sure why you're so worried. If the $5,000 a month is covering what you need, then that's fine. Okay, here's another question I got from a friend of mine who wrote me that I can't even say the name because it's like a little too close to home. Anyway, we have $400,000 left on a mortgage that has a 3.75% interest rate. We could easily pay this off with the cash in our investment accounts. We have a current net worth of about $4 million. What do you think about the idea of paying off the mortgage? We're already into the principal part. We no longer get an interest deduction. So here's something to think about. I mean, I always consider, and you've heard me say this, that liquidity is really important. And especially as you get older, in this case, these folks are in their late 40s. I don't know if you understand like why I say that whole liquidity thing, because weird stuff comes up, and I'm not just talking about a pandemic. It could be a career thing. It could be an illness, and sometimes having that liquidity, that access to money, can be so helpful. It's not that 3.75 is not a wildly high rate. It's a pretty low rate. And I don't think that paying it off does you that much good. And you can always pay it off if things are doing just fine in a couple of years. It doesn't really bother you to carry a mortgage if it's agonizing to you, sure, but you got $4 million. $4 million should be plenty. So I would not worry about it. I really would not. Okay. I hope that helps. All right, you're listening to Jill on Money. If you have a moment during the break, you know what you could do? You could just take a deep breath and say, hey, I'm listening to this radio show. Maybe I should check out Jill's other show. Jill and Mark have a whole other show. It's a podcast, and it's every single day. And it's called Jill on Money. You can find it wherever you get podcasts. If you don't know how to find a podcast, ask one of your relatives. I bet somebody you know listens to a podcast, and make that one of your pet projects during the pandemic. So check it out. It's called the Jill on Money podcast. You can get it wherever you find podcasts: Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, radio.com, Google Play, wherever. Okay, when we return, more of your questions.
Do I invest here? Should I put my money there? Jill Schlesinger can help you. Back to Jill on Money.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. This is the program where Mark and I try to help you navigate these unchartered waters. It's been a pretty darn good run for stocks, I'll tell you that much. It's hard to complain. I ran into a neighbor recently who told me that he runs a big hedge fund. And you'll like this one, Mark. I said, "You look so relaxed. You're running a hedge fund. Shouldn't you be nervous all the time?" He's like, "Nah, we took a big bearish bet in the beginning of March. We closed the position out in the beginning of April. We're taking the rest of the year off." Guy's done working. I'm not kidding. Is that unbelievable? So he's been fishing. Anyway, you're listening to the show that takes the mystery out of your financial life, but only if you send us your questions, right? Send us an email. Ask Jill at JillOnMoney.com. Ask Jill at JillOnMoney.com. This is a note from Tiffany, who writes, "I recently discovered your podcast and I'm a fan. I'm 31 years old. I completed my first full year with a cash value life insurance policy, which was or is an investment opportunity only. I already have a standard life insurance policy for the death benefit." So I think what she means is that she has a term life insurance policy. That's my guess. Okay, so now she writes, "I'd like to know, are cash value life insurance policies a good investment? I've done some research and I don't intend to pay back the money I withdraw once my money matures. And of course, at that time, I will accept that the death benefit will decrease. That's okay because I already have that term life insurance. There are so many mixed reviews about cash value life insurance, more negative than positive, and I'm beginning to second guess the investment. Hopefully, this inquiry isn't too complex. Thank you, Tiffany." Well, Tiffany, here's the thing. I think when I consider permanent life insurance, those kinds of policies that actually accumulate a cash value, I ask myself a very simple question first, and that is, do I need this insurance coverage for my whole life? Do I need coverage for what is essentially a much longer time horizon that I would need for a standard term policy? That's usually when I think any type of permanent life insurance, whether it's whole life, variable universal life, those are the only circumstances that I'm really interested in using it. I think as an investment, it's incredibly expensive. And I think that because of that, I would tend to really dissuade people from using those policies as anything but a way to ensure somebody's death benefit needs for their whole lives. Now, I also want to say something. This is really, really important. There are some policies that also offer some really cool benefits when it comes to long-term care. That's the other reason that people are looking at these permanent policies, because long-term care insurance has become so expensive. So, with that said, I don't want to make you crazy and second guess you, but I think it's probably was not a great investment for you. I may even consider just getting out of it and paying the surrender fee and moving on. I don't know how much you invested in it, but not my favorite thing. Okay. Catherine writes, "My husband and I are in our early and mid 30s. All debt is paid off, no kids yet. We're living in an expensive coastal city. We're about a year away, knock wood, from having a 20% down payment together on a home we could see ourselves staying in for at least 7 to 10 years. We have both kept our jobs through COVID so far. We know we're extremely lucky. In addition to saving up cash for our home down payment, we're also maxing out our 401ks. We've got two questions for you about how to be approaching retirement savings right now. One, over the past few years, we've both moved into high earning white collar roles where we've been lucky to see our incomes increase by more than 50% since 2016. What this means is we have a bit less than 1 year of current pre-tax salary saved in our 401ks. According to a lot of advice I see, that means we're behind on retirement savings. How should we model the right amount to have saved if we're receiving significant raises, bonus, or promotions every year?" Oh, this is very easy. I'll get back to number one. Number two is we will have maxed out our 401ks by October of this year. And now we need to know, what more do we do to keep saving? Adding cash to our down payment fund, further save for retirement. We lean towards the latter, but aren't sure what to do. Do we put some money in exchange traded funds, open an IRA? Basically, she's saying, like, you know what? We know this is not a problem, but, essentially, she says, we weren't able to save that much for retirement through most of our 20s, and we're trying to catch up now. Okay. So look, you're already putting you're maxing out your 401ks. So then what's the next thing you can do? You could try to open a Roth IRA, but that's only if you can qualify, and qualifying for a Roth, it ain't so easy. I mean, it sounds like you guys have been making a lot more money, but just to put this in the blunt terms, if you guys are making more than $206,000 this year, you can't open a Roth IRA. If it's somewhere between 196 and 206, then you can do it. But the best bet is to just open another account. Open a non-retirement investment account. Use low-cost index funds and call it a day. And look, this might change after you purchase your home. You may not be able to have so much money, but yeah, I would be just fine with you putting that money away, diligently contributing, and you can go anywhere where you can find sort of that, again, that cheap index fund environment. What are those companies? I'm talking about Schwab and Vanguard and Fidelity and TD Ameritrade and T. Rowe Price, these kinds of companies that have cheap index funds, that's the environment you should be operating in. And I mean, look, you can't go back and make up lost ground in terms of what you did in your 20s. You did what you could do. Now that you have the money, put that money to work, be diligent about it. Go ahead and buy your house, and you'll be very happy campers. I'll look forward to hearing your updates when you've bought that house. Okay, you're listening to Jill on Money. Give us a holler if you have a question. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com or go to jillonmoney.com, and there you can do all sorts of stuff like listen to past shows. Okay, we'll be right back.
.401ks, IRAs, refinancing, she covers it all. Back to Jill on Money with Jill Schlesinger.
You're back. It's Jill on Money. If you've got a financial question, we want to hear from you. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com. That is our email address. Anonymous says, I was left a small IRA, current value $227,000 when my mother died, and I am required to take a required minimum distribution. Unfortunately, I have also needed to take additional distributions to maintain a property she left us and we can't sell. I'm at the 24% tax bracket. I make $172,000. My husband makes $62,000. We have considerable debt. $32,000 credit card, $14,000 car, $35,000 retirement loan, $20,000 student loan. Our mortgage, $404,000 with a home value of $700,000. Our current mortgage is 4.62%. It's a 30-year, which we originated in the middle of 2017. Okay. My inherited IRA is with RBC, which is where my mom had it, and we get their fees. I'm expecting a settlement from an accident which caused some of our debt, which will be at least $100,000. I'm maxing out my 401k. My husband is contributing 15%, although I just logged in to change it to 25%. Current balance is $867,000 for me. I'm 48. $86,000 for him. He's 52. Current values do not include loan balance. Would you move the decedent IRA, and if so, where? And would you recommend refinancing to pay off credit card debt? All right, I just want to look at one thing. So you're in the 24% tax bracket right now. All right, so you make, I'm just going to do some quick math with you right here. So you make 172. He makes 62, so it's about 230. But you both make retirement contributions. So I'm wondering if your taxable income is probably at about 200,000. I'll tell you what I would do. Mark, you're going to think I'm insane. I would pull all the money out of this IRA, not all of it, but I would pull out at least, I probably would pull out $100,000 from this IRA to keep you in the 24% tax bracket. Take the money out, pay the tax that's due, and then with the extra money, pay down the credit card debt, pay down the car loan, pay down the student loan. Then that's done. At the same time, I would refinance. But I would get rid of that other debt first. And I have a weird concern for you to consider because as we always talk about, don't take money out of these rich, don't take distributions if you don't have to. But you're in the 24% tax bracket. And I just want to point out that if Joe Biden is elected president, and considering that we've spent trillions and trillions of dollars during the pandemic, I think it is likely that we're going to see taxes go up. And that would mean that right now, I would try to take advantage of the fact that you are in the 24% tax bracket. And I would pull as much money out of that IRA account to then be able to certainly pay off some of that consumer debt, and I would absolutely, at the very same time, I so pull the money out for this year, and then also I would move that account to a Vanguard or a Schwab or a Fidelity where you don't have to pay the fees, and you can pull the money out whenever you want. So, okay, so number one, I would pull money out, pay tax due today. Number two, I'd move that account, and number three, I would definitely refinance. Absolutely. And by the way, when you refinance, when you get rid of the credit card debt and the car loan and the student loan, your situation is going to look fantastic. I mean, you may even be able to pay off that retirement loan. I don't know if that's coming just automatically out of your payroll deductions. In all of this, I think your entire financial situation will be so much better. If the accident money does come in, okay, great. Fine. But I think this could be a pretty good time for you to settle things down and not worry at all about your future tax situation. Really, truly, it makes so much sense to do this. So I hope that helps. If I missed something, please let me know. Genevieve writes, my husband and I have simple wills. We leave everything to each other, but it also gives us the option when one passes to put some money in a remainder trust. I'm concerned because I don't want to go through probate. Does the option, just by its presence in the will, which I doubt either of us would activate, require a will to go through probate? Um, okay, so a will does not prevent probate, actually. A trust would. But it's not. I wouldn't worry about this, depending on the asset size. Probate is not the worst thing in the world. It really isn't. It's fine. It's just an easier process to navigate if you have a will, and it's not going to be. I don't think it's going to be a problem. And I think that's called usually a pour over trust. I don't know how much money you have, but it could be possible if you may want to use it. Who knows how estate laws change in the future, but I don't think that in and of itself is going to be a problem. Just remember, like if you have a bank account, that's a probatable asset. It's okay. Probate's not the worst. Again, probate's not the worst thing in the world. The will is a directive. The executor, the executrix, executes your wishes. And if there needs to be some trust created, that's fine. It can be created after the death of the first spouse. But the pour over part of it does not create more of a problem for you. So don't worry about that. Okay? You're listening to Jill on Money. During the break, go to our website, jillonmoney.com, and check out the resource section. Mark builds it up. It's got all this cool stuff in there. Lots of things for you to consider, including a bunch of retirement calculators and refi calculators. Check it out. Jillonmoney.com is the website, and we will be right back. You're back. It's Jill on Money. We are broadcasting from the Capital One Bank virtual studios. Capital One, this is Banking Reimagined. What's in your wallet? Mark, we're going to keep doing this virtual studios. Are we ever going back into a physical studio again, do you think? Mark says he's leaning towards no. Me too. I'm leaning towards a hard no on that. All right, let's get to a couple of questions before we go to a break and bring on a fantastic guest for our second hour. Okay, Rhonda writes, I love watching you on CBS this morning, and I find your segments informative. I have a question. My mom now needs home health care 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. She has a policy which pays for only 5 hours a day. She's got IRAs and she's 86 years old. Can I cash in an account without a penalty to pay for the care? You mean, can you cash in an IRA? Do you mean, I don't know if this is an IRA with a CD in it, and we're talking about that, or if if there are investments in it. But the deal is, there's probably no penalty unless it is a CD, and maybe you're breaking a CD. Otherwise, she has to pay the taxes that are due. So that would be, unless I'm missing something here, but that's what you would be focused on. Andrew keeps having problems understanding unemployment rates. So he says, in your column today, you wrote 30 million people are getting unemployment benefits. It seems close to 18 or 20% unemployment. Yet I thought the numbers that came out in July were 11.7% or something like that. Where am I going wrong? Oh, poor Andrew. I know it's so confusing. We are probably closer to a 20% unemployment rate. That is the broader unemployment rate. And just know that the weekly numbers that come out are they are not quite jibing perfectly with the monthly numbers. But I consider the unemployment rate to be about 20%, about 1 in 5 Americans. Some of the data that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics is a little sketchy right now because it's tough to make it all sync up during a pandemic. All right, now that said, hang on to your hats. We have a fantastic guest in the second hour. His name is David Epstein. He wrote a book called Range, and we're going to get into that when we come back. It's Jill on Money. Remember, just go to the website, jillonmoney.com. If you need us from there, just click the contact button. We'll be right back.
It's the weekend, and that can only mean one thing. You're listening to Jill on Money, the show that takes the mystery out of your finances. Here's your host, Jill Schlesinger.
Welcome to hour number 2 of Jill on Money, and we are here to introduce a fantastic guest. Now, I conducted this interview a while back, so this is pre-pandemic, but I want you to really focus in on some of the messaging in this interview. It's going to be great. But before we do that, I want to remind you that we are broadcasting from the Policy Genius virtual studios. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy insurance. Just go to policygenius.com. Okay, today's guest, David Epstein. He wrote a book called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And, it's so cool because he had written a book called The Sports Game. And in writing that book, he was able to kind of stumble onto something that was really interesting, and that is the difference between different athletes and how they specialize. And that led to this book. And so David is a fantastic writer. He was a great, great guest. And I thought this was brilliant of Mark to bring him back in for a little rebroadcast, especially at a time where we're being asked to do lots of different things for our employers during the pandemic. So here's our interview with David Epstein. David has written a new book. It's called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And as somebody who is a generalist, of course, I was immediately drawn to anything that reaffirms my thesis on life, which is know a little bit about a lot of stuff. So, David, you previously wrote a book called The Sports Gene. when you were lecturing about that book, something else came up. So talk about the reason you wrote this book and how it came out of the sports studies.
Right. So in some ways, I'm glad this sort of affirmed your thinking, because this project sort of began with something that overturned some of my thinking. I was in the sports world where the so-called 10,000-hour rule, this idea that early specialization and in highly technical practice and whatever you're going to do is the route to expertise. And after writing a little bit about talent in sports, I got invited to debate the writer Malcolm Gladwell at the MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, which was founded by the general manager of the Houston Rockets. And it was set up as 10,000 hours versus the sports gene. Even though we have some middle ground, this sort of talent versus practice thing. Malcolm's very clever, and I didn't want to get embarrassed, and we'd never met before, so I kind of tried to anticipate what he was going to argue. And I figured he would have to argue that athletes should develop as early as possible, get a head start in technical training and whatever they're going to do. So I went and looked at all the research I could find that tracks the development of athletes, and in fact found that athletes who go on to become elite have what scientists call a sampling period early on. They play a variety of sports, they gain a breadth of general skills, they learn about their interests, they learn about their abilities, and they systematically delay specializing until later than peers who plateau at lower levels. And so when it came to the debate, and Malcolm sort of said, look at Tiger Woods, and I said, well, look at Roger Federer, who sampled and didn't specialize until way later than his peers. And the question really is, which of these models is the norm? And here's what the data says, that the Roger model is the norm. We just don't really acknowledge it. And afterward, he sort of said, what you got me on was that Roger versus Tiger thing. We sort of became running buddies and would talk about it on our own time. And that lodged in the back of my head. And sort of another experience where I was doing some work with a foundation kind of brought it back to the forefront. I said, this is a project I need to do.
Because you open the book with the Roger versus Tiger thing, and you talk about what ultimately becomes a real difference in what they are doing. Because golf is a sport that the ball's not moving.
Right.
And it's a series of repetitive actions, strokes that you do have to master, right?
Right, absolutely.
And tennis, though, is a more dynamic sport.
Yeah.
And so is that the reason why the sampling or the early focus is not as important?
That's a great question, because the answer is largely yes. So in golf, there's kind of a dearth of data in golf, but I can absolutely believe that early specialization does work for golf, because it is like skill acquisition scientists who study it classify it as almost like an industrial task. It's non-dynamic. People wait for each other to take turns. You don't have any teammates you have to deal with. You're basically trying to recreate known motions with as little deviation as possible over and over and over. And that's a very poor model, not only for the rest of sports, but certainly for most other things that humans want to learn. Whereas in these more dynamic sports like tennis, where you need what's called anticipatory skills, the reason these athletes seem like they can react so fast is they've actually learned to pick up on body cues very quickly that tell them what's coming before it happens. And it turns out to build the scaffolding that helps you acquire those skills, you actually want this incredible breadth of challenges early on instead of this focused practice. And so I think golf, we should sort of drop it as Tiger Woods is the most famous development story maybe ever. But it turns out to be a uniquely poor model from which to extrapolate to other things.
Are there any other sports like golf where you would see that kind of early focus would pay off generally?
Yeah, I would think like targeting tasks maybe, something like archery and shooting and things like that, where they are static, where people, again, wait to take turns, where you don't require anticipatory skills.
But also in certain careers, it would make sense. We'll get to that in a second.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just go back to sports? So you're now a new father.
Yes.
How do you feel about all these people who have their kids specialize? Let me just speak from personal experience. I grew up in a time where you did not devote all of your time, energy to one sport.
Mm-hmm.
So, I played soccer and basketball, and then a generation after me, or even a half a generation, all the kids were like, no, I play soccer, I play indoor soccer, and then I play spring soccer, and then I go to summer league.
Right.
So the parents have adopted that. Is there any shift in that now, or is it still that way?
I would say it's shifting in the wrong direction for the most part in this country, but in the right direction in some other countries. And that isn't because, the science is clear. The way to the sampling period for all dynamic sports is totally the norm. But there are other forces at work here, right? Like youth athletes are customers for adults who have very significant financial interest in keeping them away from other sports, right? When I lived in Brooklyn until recently, there was a U6 travel soccer team that met across the street from me. I don't think anybody thinks 5-year-olds can't find good enough competition in a city of 9 million people. But it's you convince parents, right, that, well, if they're not on the U6 team, they can't be on the U7 team. And so you start this deselection process early where they have to get in the pipeline. These are customers, right? Whereas I played football, basketball, baseball in high school and became a university record holder in track in college. And I was just talking to Steve Nash the other day, the 2-time NBA MVP. And he said he played basketball last. He didn't get a basketball till he was 13. And so he's exploring setting up an academy to incorporate what we know about optimal development. Unlike the U.S. where we have all these like balkanized youth leagues, everyone's doing their own thing. I get it, because if you're the 8-year-old coach, the coach of 8-year-olds, not the 8-year-old coach, if your incentive is to win the 8-year-olds championship, then fine, specialize those kids. But we know that the way to develop the best 8-year-old athlete is not the same as the way to develop the best 20-year-old athlete. But if your incentive is only for the 8-year-olds, that's a problem. So like in France, they overhauled their soccer development pipeline to incorporate sampling and unstructured play. But they made those youth coaches and said, your job isn't to win as an 8-year-old, it's to help us develop these 20 and 30-year-old athletes. But we don't really have that here.
We'll get back to our interview with David Epstein in just a minute. If you have a financial question, please just send us an email. Ask Jill at jillonmoney.com. Or if you're on the website poking around, jillonmoney.com is the website. We have a contact button. It's in the upper right-hand corner. So feel free to noodle around the website, but also send us your questions. Okay, we'll be right back.
Back to Jill on Money, where Jill Schlesinger helps you take the mystery out of your finances.
You're back. It's Jill on Money, and we are delighted that you're joining us this hour. If you've got a financial question, we always love to hear from you. Our email address is askjill@jillonmoney.com. And this hour, we are in the midst of an interview that we broadcast prior to the pandemic, which is why we don't actually mention the pandemic. Our guest is David Epstein. His book is called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And in this part of our interview, we move beyond the world of sports, which is really where David came up with the concept for this book, and talk about other areas of our lives where we see the difference between generalists and specialists. And I think this interview has stayed with me a long time. I'm so happy that Mark had the idea to rebroadcast it, because it made me think about some of the things that I do in my own work life and where I'm a specialist and a generalist. So here's more of our interview with David Epstein. Okay, so now let's move beyond sports into other areas where you were learning about specialization versus generalization. Mm-hmm. And so where did you go after sports? So this was your entryway in. What did you think about next for what would be a good test case?
Well, the first thing that came to mind after sports, frankly, was music, because having written in sort of that genre of performance books before, I realized that sports and music were kind of the most associated in public consciousness with early specialization. You know, the Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother book starts on page 1 with promising the secrets to raising successful kids, and part of the list is about music. The daughters must play piano or violin. They can't play any other instrument. 5 hours of practice a day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Later in the book, of course, the talented one quits. I knew that was a domain that I would be remiss not to take on if I was talking about specialization. So it was an obvious next step from sports.
There are some areas where it does make sense. So
Yep.
You're not saying don't practice.
Nope. Absolutely
and
not.
You're not. So I just worry that sometimes people are going to look at this and see and then oh, all right, then I don't have to. No, you still have to bring your same discipline, but just to different things.
I think you just hit on one of the challenges for me as I talk about this book, which is differentiating what I'm calling a generalist here from just a dilettante who isn't that interested in or that good at anything, right? The kind of generalist I'm profiling here. And one of the reasons it's sort of late in the book that I start getting into scientists is because most people view them as the epitome of specialization, right? So I wanted to say, like, look, here are these people who have depth in an area for sure, and yet instead of getting deeper and more narrow, made their contributions because they harnessed this power of what I call range, even within what's normally a specialized area.
One of the things that caught my eye about this is that when kids or even adults are struggling to find an answer, now, you have almost like an instant ability to get to the conclusion. But getting that conclusion without struggle is actually not advancing your learning. Can you explain that?
And this kind of gets to what I think is a theme of the book, and one that was deeply and counterintuitive to me, which is that practices and habits of mind that can cause the most rapid improvement, whether this is in your work, in sports, in music, or here just in learning generally in that chapter, can systematically undermine your long-term development. That's deeply counterintuitive, that you can see progress before your eyes and somehow that's undermining you going forward. So this actually gets to, I don't want to go too far aside here, but in that chapter is one of the studies that to me was the most surprising in the entire book, which was done at the United States Air Force Academy. And it was a study that you could not set up in any other way. So the Air Force Academy brings in freshman class every year. The students also take a sequence of 3 math courses, Calculus 1, Calculus 2, so on. And they are randomized to professors in Calculus 1, then they are re-randomized in Calculus 2, and then re-randomized again. So it's this incredible experimental condition, thousands of students, about 100 professors. What the researchers wanted to look at the impact of teaching. And what the researchers concluded was those teachers who taught the most narrow curriculum, the so-called using procedures knowledge, produced students who were really well prepared for that test, but then could not connect that knowledge to broader concepts going forward. So they were hampered going forward. And that's kind of a theme of this chapter where I talk about so-called desirable difficulties, where you actually want to put in the way of the learner these types of obstacles that cause them to be frustrated, that cause their learning to slow down, but builds this more conceptual scaffolding that allows them to then learn to stack relevant things in that framework going forward.
What does that tell you about the vast majority of, say, public school teachers who are teaching to the test?
It's a huge problem. I mean, what you're going to do is you will improve how students do on that test, but that's not really what you care about, right? What you care about is what psychologists call transfer, which is the ability to take that knowledge and apply it to situations you've never seen before. So one of the strategies in the book is called interleaving, which basically means instead of practicing the same thing over and over and over.
Look, I highlighted interleaving.
There you go. So instead of practicing the same thing over and over and over, what you want to do is essentially diversify the challenges, like make the problems really different. This gets to a classic research finding I discussed in the book called breadth of training predicts breadth of transfer. The more varied your training is, the less you're doing the same thing over and over, the more able you will be to apply that knowledge to situations you've never seen before. And so we even think of things like professional development. When I've been through it, it's like you get this like one bout of something that you kind of do over and over, and then you leave it forever. And the best way to do it is to be constantly mixing up challenges, which is frustrating, but helps your ability to transfer the knowledge, and then to incorporate spacing. You want to make it easy to make it hard on yourself while you're learning, and spacing is just what it sounds like. So in a famous study of spacing, Spanish vocabulary learners split into 2 groups. One group got 8 hours of intensive study on one day. The other group got 4 hours in one day, 4 hours a month later. Same exact total study time. 8 years later, when they were brought back, the group that had the spaced practice remembered 250% more with the exact same amount of practice. That's totally different than what we normally do in school or in work. You do a topic, and then you move on to the next topic. What you want to do is split all this stuff and mix it all together, which is frustrating, but forces you to build these more conceptual models that scaffold later knowledge.
I love that. Talk a little bit about how the generalization versus specialization, how that now translates into career. Because, I am much older than you are, but when I was brought up, it was sort of like, go get a liberal arts education, figure out what you want to do, and you might fart around a little bit and go one way or go the other way, zigzag, whatever. And now it seems that we are asking our younger generation of, let's say Gen Z or whoever comes next, to find specialization, like go to code camp, become a coder. What is the problem with that model, and what is the advantage of more of the generalists. Let's just call there was a guy who wrote a book in praise of the liberal arts education. So give us both sides of that.
Yeah, and I actually decided that was Fareed Zakaria's book, and I decided to proactively stay away from that because I didn't want to prescribe a certain course, but rather that just people should be broad. And one of the main advantages, not that there's anything wrong with coding at all, one of the most important advantages has to do with what economists call match quality, which is the degree of fit between your interests, your abilities, and the work that you do. And that turns out to be incredibly important for your long-term motivation and for your productivity. And so, for example, one of the economists in the book decided to study specialization timing in colleges in different countries, and looking at some countries where students have to specialize earlier and some countries where students can experiment a little bit in college. And some of those countries otherwise have similar education systems, like England and Scotland, where in England, students kind of mid or late high school have to decide what they're going to be doing in college. In Scotland, they can keep experimenting. And he said, who wins this trade-off? The early specializers or the late specializers? And it turned out it was the late specializers. In fact, the early specializers do jump out to an income lead when they graduate because they have more sort of specific skills. The later specializers who sample different things end up optimizing their match quality more, doing better, picking a better fit. By 6 years out, they have caught and then surpassed the early specializers in income, while the early specializers start quitting their careers in much higher numbers because basically they had to choose so early that they made many more wrong choices. So I kind of liken it to if we thought about careers the way we think about dating, and we spend as much time with our careers probably, maybe more, we would stop telling people that it's a good idea to pick something early and stick with it. Because as we know, once you get a little more data and learn a little more about the world, you can match yourself a lot better.
We'll get back to our interview with David Epstein in just a minute. Hey, during the break, hop onto the website, JillOnMoney.com, and there you can go catch up on some other stuff that we do, the stuff we write, some of my TV segments, and of course, sign up for the free weekly newsletter. We'll be right back.
Do I invest here? Should I put my money there? Jill Schlesinger can help you. Back to Jill on Money.
You're back. It's Jill on Money, and this hour we are in the middle of a fantastic interview with David Epstein. He is the author of a book called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. In this part of the interview, gets a little personal, I'll admit it, talking about me. We're talking about how zigzaggers thrive in the workplace. What is a zigzagger? Well, that's someone like yours truly who starts in one part of the universe, maybe as a commodities trader, then moves into financial planning, and then ultimately moves into media. But a zigzagger is something that I think a lot of people are nervous about because you feel like, oh, I should be just focused on one thing. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. So here it is. Give it up for the zigzaggers out there. So I'm a zigzagger, and I'm wondering, is there any way that we can figure out how to find that match quality and or is it just you have to do a bunch of things?
So I think there's some of both. It for sure is not as tidy a prescription as pick a thing and just do 10,000 hours.
Right.
That's why this topic of career searching and matching is like the one topic that gets 2 chapters in the book. While it's not an easy prescription, one of the quotes that most stuck in my head is from a woman named Herminia Ibarra, a teacher at London Business School, who studies how people find good matches. What she said is, we learn who we are in practice, not in theory. And that's not just an adage she made up. This is based on a huge amount of psychology research that shows that we are actually not very good at simply introspecting without experience about what we are good at and what we will like. What she means by we learn who we are in practice, not in theory, is that there's this huge complex of career gurus and personality tests, some of them very famous, that say, take this test and we'll tell you who you are. But the psychology research shows very clearly that who you think you are right now and your insight into your abilities and interests is constrained by your roster of previous experiences, and that you have to try things and then reflect on them, which is called self-regulatory learning, and then you do that and zigzag more and more and more and more, and that's how you find match quality. And her findings are exactly borne out by the so-called Dark Horse Project at Harvard, where researchers, again, were studying how people find careers. And in this case, they were focused not only on success, but also on fulfillment. They didn't say, here's my long-term goal I'm sticking to. They said, here's who I am right now. Here are my skills and my interests. Here are the opportunities in front of me. Here's what I'm going to try. And maybe a year from now, I'll change because I will have learned more about myself. And if you don't do that, it's like what investor Paul Graham says, if you just pick a long-term goal and stick, it's what computer scientists call premature optimization. And I liked that analogy.
Isn't it more acceptable in this era to jump around into career and jobs? It's much more prevalent, isn't it?
It's totally, and in fact, I think it's more prevalent even starting with the late baby boomers. So Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that starting with the very late baby boomers is sort of when this more itinerant career stuff started. And that cohort had about 12 different jobs on average from ages 18 to 50. And now it's even more so, right? And so there's something else I mentioned in the book that's relevant to this called the end of history illusion. This psychology finding that shows that we all realize when we're asked, have we changed a lot in the past? We say, yes, of course, on all these experiences. But will we change a lot in the future? No, not that much, right? And we're always wrong. We always change more than we think. And so when you're asking people to like pick their lifelong career, it's asking them to pick for a person they don't yet know and a world they can't yet conceive. And so there is very little chance that they're going to optimize their match quality if that's what they do.
And if you were going to give advice to somebody who is looking at optimizing match quality, it would in fact be try, don't worry. If you quote unquote fail or you get bounced out of a job or you hate it, you get another job.
But the one word I would also add to that is reflect, because this characteristic of these so-called self-regulatory learners who do over time get more insight into themselves and more accurately assess their own strengths and weaknesses the way that sort of their own managers do, they take a little time to reflect on those experiences. They make sure to have some insight into it and to use it for the lessons. I mean, for me, like I was training to be a geologist in grad school, right? And I started to realize, okay, that I was getting way more narrow than I wanted to be, you know? So I started to get insight in myself and say, am I the type of person who wants to spend my whole life learning one thing new to the world or much shorter spans of time learning things new to me and translating them, and that my advantage over the other scientists all had to do with like communication and writing and wanting to read outside my domain.
I started my career because my dad was a trader on the floor of the American Stock Exchange. My godfather was a trader on the New York Stock Exchange, which meant that in high school and summer and college summers, that's what I would do. And so, of course, that's what I did. I remember so like crystal clear memory that I built the proof of the thesis, like Jill should become a trader, and I built the proof to support this idea. Then I got there, and I didn't really like it. I was kind of miserable. And so then I left the trading floor, and I went into financial planning, investment management. And I had a couple of dopey jobs along the way, but you know, they were fun, you know, and I did learn a lot. One was horrible and one was fun. I remember then saying, okay, well, now, you know, I'm in my late 20s and I have to get serious. And so I'm going to pick a career called financial planning, investment management. And I did that for a number of years. And I thought, this is it. This is my life. But what I really learned, and as I now reflecting on it, those were great jobs for as long as I had them. But there were aspects of it that were terrible for me and for my personality that really didn't match, which, you know, I was over-involved. I got too emotional. I got worried when people didn't take my advice. I couldn't sleep at night because I thought like, oh my God, David didn't buy enough life insurance and he's not buying enough and now I'm worried and what happens? And all of that was just not a good match because I was so hyper about it. But I know that if you asked me 20 years ago, is this the career for your life? I would have said, absolutely. Let me tell you all the reasons why. So what can we do to kind of help people pick their heads up a little bit and reflect more in real time? Is it possible?
I think it is. And by the way, I doubt if you asked you 20 years ago, you would have said, podcasting, right? That's because you just don't know what's going to be there. But I bet you took a lot of those lessons, right? Because now the very lifeblood of what you're doing has to do with like diverse interests and being able to ask. I mean, look at me. I'm probably an unusual guest for the things you're looking at, but you can still engage with these ideas in ways that are totally relevant to you and your listeners. And so I think the reflection in real time is absolutely real. And the other thing I think is that we should not consider those experiences where you thought something was going to be your career and it isn't to be bad, because you will use that knowledge. It's not a sunk cost.
We'll get back to our interview with David Epstein in just a minute. If you wouldn't mind, how about this? During the break, go subscribe to our podcast. It's called Jill on Money. You can get it wherever you find your favorite podcasts. If you don't know where that is, that could be Apple or Stitcher or Spotify or radio.com or Google Play, wherever. Okay, we'll be right back.
.401ks, IRAs, refinancing, she covers it all. Back to Jill on Money with Jill Schlesinger.
You're back. It's Jill on Money, and we are talking to David Epstein this hour. He is the author of a book called Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And, look, last segment where we were talking about zigzaggers, people who have different experiences which can help them kind of move through the workplace with maybe a different mindset. In this segment, I start honing in on something that I think is kind of an interesting idea, and that is that what about the kind of leader who's really only done one thing? You know what I mean by that? Meaning that, let's say you were just in a very narrow lane, maybe it's technology, and maybe it's one area within technology. And in that narrow lane, you were asked to do a certain type of thinking only. What happens when you are now the leader and it requires you to go in a different place, in a different direction? How do these leaders manage this? I am very interested in understanding whether there is some risk in the kind of people who lead in that way. That's what we're talking about with our guest, David Epstein. He is the author of the book Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. So here's the rest of our interview with David Epstein. All right, let's go back to one last question that I have, because you brought up Mark Zuckerberg. I guess that I have like this strain of anxiety around a lot of the young guys who build these companies and they think they're so powerful and they want to move fast and break crap. It worries me that they are not zigzaggers, because they come to these organizations that they are now mammoths, and do they have the skill set to run it in a world that's so much more complicated than they could ever conceive?
Yes, this gets to a really, one of the underlying themes of Range that I think is a tremendous problem for society at large, which is that when Mark or whoever does what he does, it seems to lead to this assumption that because he figured out the algorithm for a social media site, that he has somehow figured out the master algorithm of life and can do anything else without having to be interested in other things. And I think this also gets to the difference between generalists and dilettantes. Again, the generalists I'm describing in this book are people who are genuinely interested in many different things. Whereas what I perceive in a lot of these younger tech founders is they learned how to make a website work. Therefore, other things are just systems. They can make those other things work. We see this a lot in medicine, where when Mark Zuckerberg said we're going to cure all disease within 100 years, one of the interventions he mentioned as being groundbreaking was cardiac stents, where you open up the blood vessels and can save people's life during a heart attack. But it's much more commonly used when someone has stable chest pain, basically, because they have chest pain, they have a narrowed artery, you prop it open. How could that not work? And it turns out a dozen randomized controlled trials have shown it does not work. What you care about is those people having heart attacks or strokes or dying. And it turns out they have heart attacks and strokes and die at the exact same rate, just with one more open blood vessel. It isn't a website. We didn't design the human body. It's much more complex. There's all this interacting stuff. And so I think this sort of lack of curiosity in other things, that because you had this big success and all these people around you, I'm sure, become sort of yes people, that you don't have to have a curiosity or a holistic view of things. And I think that's really, really dangerous, that we allow people to have success in one area, often in a kind environment maybe, and assume that somehow they've just figured out the code to life and it translates everywhere else.
Like I'm going to throw $100 million at the Newark school system and fix it.
Yeah.
How'd that work?
Money was one piece of a much more complex problem there. And so I think it was naive to assume that that's what was going to fix the problem. And if you looked at that, there were a lot of places where money is not the problem and there's still school system issues. So I think that was a lack of appreciating historical context.
Another part of Range deals with people who are, let's say, specialists, and their ability to maybe look at what could happen in the future. And they do kind of sell themselves. All the time I get pitched like, well, Joe can come on your show and Joanne can come on your show and she'll tell you where the market's going next.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So this is the topic of Chapter 10, this political and economic prediction. And unfortunately, it's probably a pretty good heuristic that if they're getting pitched to you, they probably are not good forecasters. They may have made a good prediction in the past, right? But there's not good accountability for all their bad predictions. Chapter 10 follows a 20-year study where a psychologist looked at expert predictions about geopolitical and economic phenomena. He had to get 82,000 concrete predictions, specific probabilities with end dates, because you have to separate luck from skill, streaks, so you need lots of predictions. And what he found was that there was basically an inverse relationship between confidence and, in many cases, credentials and forecasting ability. So the worst forecasters, what he called the hedgehogs, were people who had spent their entire career working on basically one problem and began to see every issue through that one lens. And so no matter what they were predicting, and they had so much information in that narrow lens or that narrow area that they could fit any story anytime to their theory. And they were such bad predictors that they got worse as they accumulated credentials. And not only that, when you make a prediction and it turns out wrong repeatedly, you're supposed to update those beliefs. This is Bayesian thinking for people who are familiar with that. The worst specialists, the most narrow specialists, would update in the wrong direction, where when they would get stuff wrong, they would reinforce their previous beliefs that sent them wrong. They would always just say, I was just wrong by a little, or the timeline was just off, right? This is what a lot of investment is like. I was right, the timeline was just off.
Right. I told you the tech stocks were going to sell off, but you told me 3 years before they actually did.
If the timeline is off, you are wrong when it comes to these sorts of things, and you're not accountable.
All right. We will have a link to David Epstein's book. It is so good. I really encourage you to buy it because it does give you a really different way of thinking about your own experiences in the workplace. And hopefully you've learned quite a bit about becoming a generalist in this period of time. When we return, we'll finish up with a couple of questions from you guys. Again, our email address, askjill@jillonmoney.com. We'll be right back. You're back. It's Jill on Money. We are broadcasting from the Policy Genius virtual studios. Policy Genius is the easy way to compare and buy insurance. Just go to policygenius.com. Okay, before we close out the program, let's get to one more email. Christine writes, several months ago, I froze my low-risk investment in a 401k through work because I had lost over $13,000 in less than a month when COVID-19 hit. Right now, there's currently $81,000 in there. It grows with my 10% contribution and my company's match. I'm going to retire next year. I don't want to lose any more money, but I'm afraid to unfreeze it. What advice would you give at this juncture, as I'm not sure what to do? Christine, I doubt you're going to use all this money at once, but if you don't want to do anything, you can just try to, keep it in the money market for one more year. But aren't you going to want that money to grow? Aren't you worried about inflation? Don't you have some concerns about just generally not being able to keep pace with the rising prices that we know we're going to get? I think this becomes such a big problem when we're looking at our retirement accounts. You think, I'm retiring in a year, but that money, you're not going to access that money anytime soon, unless you are. If you really need the money within a year, then locking it down and keeping it in a money market makes sense. Will you have a pension? Will you have other income? Are there some other sources that you will need to be using to help pay for your bills? These are the things we would like to know. I'm sorry you lost the money. You see what happens when we try to time the market. It is awfully difficult. Okay, that's it. That's the program. I want to thank everyone for listening. And remember, if you have a question throughout the week, all you have to do is send us an email, askjill@jillonmoney.com. We want to thank our guest, David Epstein, and we also want to thank Joel Goodman. He composed our music, Mark Talercio, our executive producer extraordinaire. And I also want to remind you to wash your hands, wear your masks, maintain your physical distancing, and do something nice for somebody else out there. It will make you feel good. It is good juju in the universe. Okay, we'll talk to you next week.